Next, we have Dr. Richard Watson, and he's a consulting geologist out of Port Aransas. He got his PhD from the University of Texas. 40 years experience on the Texas coast. He's an expert on waves, beaches, tidal inlets, and Texas coastal history. Richard?
Thank you. Tony mentioned critters walking on that stuff. Well, back in the early 70s, I was living on my sailboat in the University Marina at Port Aransas while I was a graduate student, and we had one of the biggest accumulations of sargassum ever, and the top 3 feet of the marina was solid sargassum. No boats could come or go except for the Longhorn. If you had a boat that pumped seawater for cooling, forget it. Well, they tried to wash the stuff out with the Longhorn, and of course it just went in circles. And my dog thought he'd take a shortcut across the corner of the marina on the grass. And it was pretty interesting trying to get the dog out of that stuff. All right. Oh, and I just done a bottom job on my boat, which cost me hundreds of dollars worth of materials. It was a wooden sailboat that had to be hauled every 6 months. And that stuff went acid. Seawater is basic. It turned the copper oxide bottom paint into copper sulfate and turned the red paint black, and I had to haul it out and do another bottom job. Just
Richard.
Yes.
Reminder.
Yes, I got it. Thank you. I'm recording this so that I can put it on my website later, merged with the slides. Well, I'm not going to talk much about what this does to the animals and the wildlife. I'm interested in that, but my main thrust is going to be that we are now on a seriously eroding coastline with a very few exceptions, and we need to be managing the beach and the dunes because they're our natural seawall protecting us from storms. This is Surfside Village, taken last November, and you can see all the houses on the beach. They've got no beach left. GLO's about to put a revetment in there, but apparently it's not going to go all the way down to the jetty, which doesn't make much sense. And this is one of the places where it's really not harmful to put in a seawall or a revetment because the sediment transport moves from the top down to the bottom, and a few miles south of there is the Brazos River Delta, which is supplying sand to the beach. So it's not going to starve any downdrift beaches. And they certainly don't have to worry about something causing any more beach erosion. They have to worry about not losing the rest of the town. Those houses are plenty scared. However, I understand that the GLO's buying them for $50,000 a piece or something. And I really approve of helping the people out because nearly all of the beach erosion on the Texas coast is man-made. 100 years ago, most of the barrier islands were accreting, but we've built jetties as long as 3 miles at Galveston to have ports, and we have to have ports. And the Galveston jetties, for instance, are holding about 5 million dump trucks worth of sand in permanent storage, which can no longer move along the shoreline. And so that's starving the beaches. And then we've built reservoirs on all of our rivers, and the few that reach the coast, the Brazos River only produces about a quarter of the sand that it used to before the reservoirs, and the Rio Grande rarely even has water reach the coast anymore. So these are very necessary things for people to live in Texas. We need the reservoirs and we need the ports, but that has caused the beach erosion. And just as a side thing, I think that all of the people of Texas ought to be buying the property that's being lost by private owners for the same reason that when the state builds a reservoir, it has to buy the land under it. Well, they didn't anticipate this when they built the reservoirs 50 years ago, but here it is. Well, here we are at the Padre Island seawall where we are right now in 1970, and I'm sorry for the terrible picture. I lived on boats for 23 years and my old slides are mildewy. But it does show that there was a wide beach, maybe 300 feet wide in front of the seawall in 1970. Well, here's September 2007, and that's after most of the sand which was placed there from dredging Packery Channel has eroded away. And it will continue to do so because the natural shoreline is now well back from the seawall, which you can see if you go down at the south end of it. Because the shoreline here is eroding at probably, 1 to 3 feet a year, something like that. That doesn't sound like much, but when you start talking in decades and 50-year time periods, it gets quite significant. Well, here's a picture I took a few weeks ago. We're right here. You can see at the south end of the seawall, there really isn't any beach left. They made a big mistake as well. They should have built the jetty right at the north end of the seawall here, because that would have moved this fillet south, and this protected area behind the seawall would have protected more of the seawall, and it would have had more beach in front of it. But they didn't do that because it would have had private land next to the Packery Channel. And Packery Channel was really built for development. They said it was being built as a beach restoration project for the seawall. Well, that was a side benefit. The real reason it was being built was a boat pass. That was a big lie, because they couldn't build a boat pass because that was against the law. The Corps of Engineers can't build small boat passes, only ones for commercial vessels. They don't have any money to maintain them. So the boat pass was built as a beach nourishment project. However, they didn't put it in the right place to protect the beach. Okay. Well, this is some data from the GLO, and Jim Jabot here probably produced this data, working for the Bureau of Economic Geology. Their work is beyond fantastic. I used to go out surveying with optical surveying instruments to measure stuff like this. He goes out in an airplane, does it just as accurately in a 600-meter wide swath at 100 miles an hour. That's not fair. So we can see beach erosion rates along Mustang, North Padre Island, ranging from 0, where it's stable, to accreting because it's in the lee of the jetties. The waves coming from the north have a wave shadow in here, so sand comes up here and gets trapped and stays there. So we have, 1 to 6 feet of long-term beach erosion along that piece of shoreline, and our beaches are getting narrower. That's a big problem for the future. Of course, the developers want to build as close as they can to the beach. Well, let's see what's happening. Well, this is supposed to be the good and bad of beach management. This was the scene that made me go nuts a couple years ago and try to shut Port Aransas down on what they were doing. The natural process is that the longshore sediment transport brings sand up along the beach and provides the sand on the beach, which then blows inland and becomes vegetated and grows the dunes. Hurricanes erode the dunes back as much as 200-300 feet in a single large storm, and it takes decades for them to build forward again. And the normal thing is the dunes erode back and forth. Well, Hurricane Rita deposited this berm here in front of the dunes. Well, that's where the, quote, beach road is. So the city moved, you ready for this? 8,000 dump trucks of sand, which was going to build the dunes stronger. We've got $1 billion worth of real estate behind that, and they dumped it in the edge of the water. Well, I started talking about this, and somebody else, it wasn't me, called the Corps and told them about this. Well, that's illegal. You have to have a Corps permit to do that, and they didn't have one. Now they're trying to get one, and I hope they don't start doing this, because that's moving sand in the wrong direction. If you got to move it, you ought to move it up into the dunes and make the dunes stronger, not push it down to the edge of the water where it's going to wash down to somebody else's beach. Well, in 1980 was the last significant hurricane we had, and that was Hurricane Allen. And I remember it well because I winched my 46-foot sailboat across sandbars into an undeveloped canal on Padre Island, buried 7 anchors up on the sand fingers, and came back and found out I still had a boat and lots of other people didn't. I was young and strong, and that was in the summer and August. I couldn't do that now. Well, you can see how wide the beach is at the main part of Port Aransas here. That doesn't look exactly right, does it? What's going on here? Well, what's going on here is this is where our road is, and right about here on the inside of that higher dark green ridge is where it had eroded back due to Hurricane Allen. They basically kept scraping the beach and did not allow those dunes and the dune grasses to build seaward, because had it allowed to go seaward over the intervening 28 years, it would be out about where the line of this parked cars is, just like it is down here. Now, some of this down here, about half of that, in this area right here, is due to them dumping seaweed and sand there and building it up artificially. The first core of this was built artificially by the city of Port Aransas, and believe it or not, the post-Hurricane Allen beach mile markers are completely buried, the telephone pole mile markers, in that ridge. About in maybe 1996 to 1998, Tony Amos and I took the city council down to the beach and had them put some bollards in down here, I don't know, about 30 feet out from that ridge to allow a new dune ridge to build naturally. And you'll see that a little later on. But anyhow, this wide beach, this part of it here, would be completely covered with vegetation and dunes had it been allowed to, and this $1 billion worth of real estate behind it would be better protected. Well, we've got to keep the beach better for tourists. However, I don't think the Open Beaches Act means that you have to have the beach drivable. It's kind of like, well, if you want to drive on it at your own risk, fine, but now we have it so that the tiniest lowrider cars can make it down there without getting stuck. Anyhow, this is the boundary between Port Aransas and Corpus Christi sometime last year. There's lots more information on my website, texascoastgeology.com, including a lot of air photos if you're interested. I think I got the city to move this because I went down there and I took that picture and showed it to the city manager, and I said, your signs are going to make it so cars can't drive down the beach. That's a less than great place for that sign. I think they moved it. Tony probably knows. Did they? No? Oh, okay. Well, that makes sense. The city of Corpus Christi was picking up every little bit of stuff. Well, the city, after we had a beach maintenance committee for over a year, and we worked with the city, and the GLO hired an expert, and we all came to the same conclusions, which are partially ignored, even though we had the city staff and everybody on board. They've at least decided to not pick up little accumulations like this, except in the main part of town, because this isn't really causing anybody much harm. And so there's a good deal less scraping that was going on, particularly south of Access Road 1A. So that's a good thing. And you can see where the stuff is being stacked here up in the front of the dunes, and it's abnormally steep, and it probably doesn't get as good a vegetation. I was at a meeting a few weeks ago where a dune building expert who builds dunes, who works for U.S. Agriculture Department, said that the best dune vegetation are bitter panicum and sea oats because they have long roots and will go down maybe as much as 20 feet. However, they have to start down low where there's water and grow up. They'll grow up faster than the dune can build up naturally. You can't plant them on top of a real high thing and have their roots reach water and stabilize the whole structure. So building this stuff up too fast ends up with a relatively weak structure which will just melt away when storm waves hit it. So that's a bit of a problem too. Okay, well, this is just another picture. This is down in the Corpus Christi area. I stopped and that guy said, well, what are you doing? And I said, well, why do you ask? He said, you want me to explain what we're doing here? I said, I know damn well what you're doing here. So I took his picture, but I don't think he liked it very much. There he goes. And at least the stuff does get partially vegetated, but the beach morning glory isn't a good stabilizing vegetation. It's a pretty good primary colonizer, I guess. And we hardly have any sea oats like those pictures that Tony showed on San Jose Island. I know where there's some in Port Aransas, but I'm not telling anybody, because they look so nice in flower arrangements. And what do they put in flower arrangements? The seed heads. Okay, I mentioned that dune that built naturally when Tony and I got these bollards put in. That's quite an accumulation in about 8 years. However, had this whole beach been able to operate naturally, this is where the dune line would be roughly now, about where the eastern limit of the bollards are.
Richard, we had a sea turtle nest in there. I don't know if you know that.
No, I didn't know that.
A couple of years ago.
Are they good to eat? I've eaten them in Honduras, you know. I didn't. I had some in Cayman that were farm raised, but Betsy was walking by a friend's house, and the friend said, "Come on in, Miss Betsy, we're sinning." And they were eating sea turtles.
Well, we don't appreciate stories about eating sea turtles. I'm serious.
All right, there's several ways that have come up that I think are better. I would rather just leave the beach alone, okay? Well, that isn't going to happen because of tourism. So if the stuff has to be moved, and it looks like what they were doing was dumping it back in the edge of the water, which isn't so great for the tourists anyway. And my biggest interest is hurricane protection, having been through several of them. And I'd like to see the dunes, if they're not going to be allowed to be built naturally and as far out as they can, well, let's, at least if we have to move this stuff, let's put it where it'll build the dunes stronger into a stronger, not quite so natural dune seawall. And this is that line, the outer edge of that line of dunes in Port Aransas that I just showed you, that was built entirely by the wind, just by keeping the traffic further out. And here they've disposed of a whole bunch of sand and seaweed in there and built the intervening valley between those two dune ridges up more solidly, and that'll get vegetated in. So that's, from my point of view, a much better way of disposing of this stuff. Here's one air photo. I saw this when they made this cut several months ago. I saw it from the air, and then I went down and found it on the road and took a picture, and obviously someone had been in there with a bulldozer or a front end loader, and they made this road, and they had a little tiny cleared off area here, but no seaward or anything. So I went down to the city to find out if someone had actually gotten a permit to go through the dunes like that, because I couldn't believe that they had. Well, it turns out it was the city themselves, and this is General Land Office land in here. And the reason they did that was, this is what they're calling backstacking. They're building it up behind the main dune ridge now, which again, it's not as good as just leaving the beach natural. However, this will build up the elevation here. It will get vegetated in sort of a man-made dune and help serve it for protection of what's behind it. So I think that's better than shoving it off in the water or carting it off to a distant location. Apparently so does the GLO. I'm not worried about this cut, because they'll fill that in when they're done using that spot, and it'll quickly get vegetated in. So this is another solution that I think is on the good side if you have to do something. Here's a close-up of that. And that's a pretty good accumulation of stuff there, and I assume that one's still active. It looks like they have room to do a lot more. And something that I think would, public-private things are good. Anybody who's a private landowner, I think, ought to be thrilled if the cities would do this on their own property, especially building weak places in the dune ridge up. One guy was going to provide a piece of land for the city to do that, but then he decided he wanted, I think, over $100,000 for the city to build up his land. He should have been thrilled to get the sand. Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
I was going to say, Richard, Cinnamon Shores contacted the city and did want the backstacking, so we did start a spot down there a couple weeks ago.
Excellent. Well, I'm not going to say it's excellent. It's not what I'd like to see y'all do, but it's a heck of a lot better than the alternatives that were being done. So some good is coming out. Well, look at this. The Mustang Island is narrow. The beaches. This was taken, when did I take this? I don't know, a couple months ago. It used to be that we had a really wide beach at all times of the year. Sometimes you couldn't drive down it in even a four-wheel drive. That was because of trees on the beach and stuff like that. But it's narrow, and it's getting narrower. In order for sand dunes to grow naturally, you have to have a reasonably wide, dry beach as a source area for sand to blow up there. Well, we don't have that anymore. So what does that mean? We're on an eroding shoreline that's eroding at 1 to 5 feet a year, depending on where you are in this part of the coast. Well, now it means we're going to start losing dunes. The county wisely put in a 350-foot dune protection zone to where you had to only build behind that 350 feet, and I got really behind them, considering it was people I was usually fighting against. That was pretty amazing. And I was thrilled that they did that, because it's very wise not to build any structures within 350 feet of the vegetation line, and that includes nearly all the dune ridges. That, of course, does allow them to tear down dunes that are further in, but those are not protective dunes. They're good at habitat, but we're not going to get everything we want, and the place is going to develop, and it'll probably end up looking like New Jersey, which is where I came from, which is why I got interested in this stuff in the first place. Well, anyhow, whoops, can I go back?
Yeah.
A wide section of beach is needed as a source if you want dunes to grow naturally. We don't have it any longer. They're not going to keep growing naturally where that doesn't exist. So the new 350-foot setback was a very good thing. How did that happen? That's John Adams and I were flying along in my airplane one day looking at stuff, and I don't know if he knew about this, but I didn't. And he said, "Look at that, Richard." And I was looking at Packery Channel, and I didn't even notice it till he said it. And so we circled around and took some pictures. This is a picture taken just a few weeks ago, but I do not understand why this was permitted.
It's called dune restoration.
Yeah, right. I think whoever called that dune restoration, their daddy ought to take them to the restroom. Or is that the restoration room? I'm not sure. Anyhow, they just left the tiniest little bit of vegetated edge here, and they bulldozed everything down, and then they took sand from elsewhere and built it up higher, and it's supposedly going to get all vegetated in and be good prediction. However, that dune vegetation expert from the agriculture department said it ain't going to work. First of all, they're carrying they stacked up all the old, maybe this is where it is, the old vegetation that they scraped off to spread around here for it to reseed. He said, well, the two important plants don't grow from seeds like that. They need to have rhizomes, spread them underground, and it's too high up for them to get down to the water, and the roots won't be going down all the way through the thing like it would if it built up naturally to tie it together. That's kind of the rebar of sand dunes, is the long roots of those plants going down deep. So whether or not they're going to succeed, though they will succeed in getting it vegetated on the top, and they're going to water it, and they dare not succeed at it, because otherwise all the sand will blow into their development. So they'll get it vegetated, but it probably won't be with plants that have a long, deep root system, and so it's quite likely that this thing will erode very rapidly in a storm and further back than other places do. So anyhow, it's an interesting experiment. We'll see how they succeed at it. Well, this is what the beach used to look like on Mustang Island about 40 years ago. Little coppice dunes out on the beach. They don't exist anymore. Nice beach morning glories. It was a real pretty place. That's another one of my crummy old slides, but you don't see it like that anymore. And the beach was much wider. This was probably down around near Access Road, too. I used to camp down there a lot. Well, anybody think we're going to get any more hurricanes and tropical storms?
Looks like it came out of the drain.
Yeah, that's kind of what I call my bad hair day, But I mean, really, I think we're going to have some more storms hit the Texas coast, and it would be really nice if we manage the beach so that we have dune protection for the next time one of these comes along. And you really don't want to park too close to the beach. That was Padre Island in the late 60s. I mean, too close to the edge of the water. Not even for a little while if you're down in the shell beaches. That's all. Thank you. Any questions?
Richard,
Yeah.
did the North Padre Island seawall we're sitting behind have anything to do with the erosion in front of it?
Well, seawalls cause the beach in front of them to erode more rapidly when storm waves are reaching the seawall. You've seen waves hit seawalls in the movies and on TV, and the water shoots way up high in the air. Well, it shoots down just as hard. This is a stepped seawall, so it reduces that somewhat. So yeah, they do increase the beach erosion in front of them when the waves are hitting the seawall. They can do a good job like they do at Galveston, but at the cost of having no beach in front of it. That's the normal situation. The other thing they do is they act as a marker to show where the shoreline used to be as a shoreline is eroding. If you go to a wild place where there's nobody living and there's no structures on a barrier island, there's a beach and there's dunes and there's vegetation behind it. The whole barrier island may be migrating in a landward direction, but there's always a beach. But as soon as you have valuable structures there, then they have to be protected, and you end up with seawalls and jetties and groins and all of the above, and houses sitting out on the beach, and then pilings sitting out on the beach, and septic tanks, and and all of the rest of it, which you would never see in the wild place because that shoreline may be eroding just as well, but the man-made markers and the valuable real estate aren't there to point it out to you. Yeah.
If the primary problem with erosion is that we have a decreased sand budget, what's wrong with taking sand and putting it to the water's edge?
You taking sand from where?
Well, from, for instance, for example, all the sand that's been piled up in the fore dunes during previous beach management, take some of that and put it at the water's edge, cover up the
That's a very bad idea because our recent beach management plus the reduced sand budget plus the narrower beaches have reduced the rate and width at which the sand dunes rebuild themselves between hurricanes. They'll erode back as much as 200-300 feet in a bad hurricane, and then it will take decades for them to build seaward again and put that natural dune seawall back in place. So that's the worst place to take sand from. If you want to take sand from a dredging project in a channel or dredging offshore or even trucking it in, which they're doing at some places with costs now pushing $40 a cubic yard, fine. But don't take it from your natural dune seawall. The other importance of those dunes is that when you have a hurricane, the dunes erode, that sand moves seaward, flattens the profile, makes the hurricane waves break further offshore. It basically buys you time, but it takes decades for that loss during that storm to rebuild. And you get 2 bad storms in a row, you're going to need all the dune protection you can possibly have. So taking sand anywhere from the upper beach, in fact, moving sand in the direction opposite to which it naturally moves, that is from the sea toward the land, is a really, really bad idea if you want to have good dune protection, protecting all that real estate behind it. Here we have a situation where the natural system, at no cost to us, builds us the very best storm protection in this part of the coast, a high vegetated dune ridge. It's free. Other places you have to spend a fortune building seawalls, which do not give as good a protection unless they're a massive one like the Galveston seawall, and then you end up with no beach. So taking sand away from the natural seawall, which is forming, free of charge for us, is very, very foolish. Yes?
Yes, sir. Dr. Watson, first of all, briefly, thanks a lot for speaking up to the APHBs that went to the Wind Turbine Conference for the Kennedy County Wind Turbine Farm over there. As well. But now on this, what about an artificial sand retention device, say at the south end of the seawall, where it's most critical with regard to beach sand erosion? For example, there's a proposal currently for the Mustang Island State Beach Park to have a V-shaped geotube assembly offshore, the sand retention, make the surf break. So what about something like that at the south end, or even something more simple and even primitive, like where I grew up in Florida, set some bollards out underwater from that south end of the seawall, perhaps with some connecting struts to retain the sand. And you get piles like you do from the jetties. It's roughly halfway between the other 2 sand retention devices here, which are the Ball Feeder and, of course, the new macro channel jetties.
Well, bollards aren't going to do much. That's kind of a really leaky groin, and it's probably against state law to build groins for that purpose. In fact, I'm pretty darn sure that it is. The problem, I have less problem with the offshore reef, and if they're going to build one, that would be a more worthwhile place to put it because it might help do the added benefit of building sand up in the front of the seawall. However, the surfers don't like that idea because that's already a good surfing location, and they don't want to risk messing it up. I think the cost is probably fairly extreme, and I'm not at all convinced that will work for several reasons. One, geotubes don't last very long, and 2, the places that they showed where they put those in making successful surf breaks were places that had clean, long-period waves coming in from distant storms. We rarely get that. In fact, we do when there's a hurricane somewhere else in the Gulf, and we get some sort of clean waves when you have a norther blowing against the remaining waves coming in from the southeast wind and steepening them up and cleaning them up a little bit. But I'm not sure that you'll even get that good a surf break. It would have to be pretty far out because the outer bars out, I don't know, 1,200 feet from shore. So that may or may not work as a surf break. If anything that's an obstruction will reduce the wave energy coming into the coast and will build up the beach at that location a little bit. However, there's a cost. That means it's starving the beaches downdrift by the same amount that's being trapped there. That sand's not allowed to move along the shoreline. There's no free sand supply unless it's coming out of a dredge pipeline from somewhere else. There's a huge, boy, the environmental crowd's going to shoot me now. Anybody got a gun in here? Because I better watch out. There's a huge amount of sand in the flats inland of Packery Channel and Newport Pass that could be dredged up to go in front of the seawall. They could have done that a lot cheaper than building the pass, but of course that's not why they built the pass anyway. The vegetation will grow faster if you take that sand from the flats because the piping plovers will be in there for fertilizer.
That's not funny. Let's not have jokes about things that some people spend their lifetimes trying to protect.
Okay, Tony.
Well, sir, so how else could it be saved there, if you will, on the south end?
The only thing is beach nourishment. The thing about beach nourishment, as long as you're not doing serious damage, which would have happened from the source I just mentioned, if you're not doing serious damage at the source that you're picking up the sand, beach nourishment does no harm to the shoreline where you put it in. Rigid structures do. I grew up in New Jersey, which is one continuous rigid structure. It's pretty horrible. And in fact, doing that to coastlines is now called New Jerseyfication of the shoreline. That's the term among coastal engineers and coastal geologists.
I think we're going to have to move on.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Richard, very much.